Hey folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for Philosophy 114 Global Moral Issues. We are kicking off Unit 5 and taking a look at a new topic for these couple of weeks. So the focus for these weeks is what we'll refer to as economic justice, or distributive justice, as we'll talk about here in a few minutes. And this is the main overview of the topic, same format as we've done for the other units. So today, what we're going to look at is an introduction and sort of overview of the types of problems and topics that we look at here in this class or here for this unit. We're going to look at some of the conceptual issues having to deal with justice and how we should approach those. We're going to glance over a couple of different kinds of rights and how they play a role in these problems. And then introduce our second question for the unit, which relates to our central topic, whether or not we have what's called a duty of beneficence, which will make a whole lot more sense here in just a little while. But to start off, let's start with the basics. Keep things nice and simple for now. Suppose that, just like if you were in an elementary school math problem, you have a pile of cookies to distribute to a large group of people. Now, just like in a math problem, where you were learning long division or whatever else, we might wonder, how should you distribute those cookies? What pattern or structure or rules should you do to make sure that things are just distributed as well or as fairly as they should be? One of our instinctual solutions, and one of the most intuitive, is to simply give one cookie to everybody and give an equal distribution to each of the various people. If we're especially focused on what a fair distribution of these things would be, this seems to be the easiest solution, and it's the one that you get at with all those division problems and everything. But unfortunately, the world is often more complicated than elementary school level math problems. You see, there are often complications in the sense of people have different degrees of need. Some people in particular may be particularly hungry, others may be particularly full and don't need cookies or desserts at all. You might also have the issue of some people in the world may already have their own pile of cookies. So now, the original solution of simply giving one to everybody, giving an equal amount to everyone, no longer seems quite as fitting or as fair. If some people are in need of something far more than others, it seems as though there's a pretty intuitive argument to say that they ought to have more. Similarly, if someone already has some number of cookies, it's hard to argue that you ought to give them more. But this seems odd. On the one hand, it seems like the needs and the conditions of the people you're working with do play a large role in what's fair. But at the same time, many of us would insist that being fair requires us to give one to everybody. And it's this tension, it's this clash, and these questions on how to distribute limited resources that we're going to be focusing on today. Because even though some situations may seem very simple, at least at first glance, the actual state of the world and figuring out precisely what's fair and what we ought to do with our limited resources end up being very complicated moral questions. And overall, these are what we can call questions or issues of distributive justice. So usually in English, when we talk about justice, we talk about things having to do with crime and punishment and whatever else. But justice more generally has to do with people getting or giving people what they're due. That is, doing what's right, fulfilling our obligations, giving people what they deserve or what we owe to them, whether it be punishment or reward or whatever else. And generally when we talk about justice, at least in philosophy, we try and make the distinction between distributive justice and retributive justice. Retributive justice is usually what we talk about in English when we talk about this. When we talk about the justice system, or we talk about criminal justice or that sort of thing, we're usually talking about retributive justice. We're talking about fair punishment for wrongdoing. And so retributive justice has to do with a certain amount of retribution for the things that are done. It has to do with people getting punishments or rewards that they're due to their actions. And so it's giving people what they deserve in a conduct sense. But when we talk about giving people what they're due, giving people what they deserve, We can also approach this in the context of distributing limited resources in some sort of a fair or just manner. And this is what we call distributive justice. Just as the name implies, it has to do with the distribution, with the fair distribution of goods and resources. Now, when we talk about this, just like with the brief little cookie example, because of the way the world is, I'll switch over my little laser pointer dot. Because of the way the world is, where some people have more than they need and others have far too little, a fair distribution might not automatically mean that everyone gets the exact same thing. So, when we talk about distributive justice, when we talk about a fair distribution of goods and resources, we shouldn't automatically think that fair means equal in amount. Instead, the fair that we're talking about, or the way that we're going to use the term fair, is to refer to something more general. We're not trying to assume an answer to this question yet. So in our case, fair is going to talk about what's fitting, just, right, or due to somebody, what you ought to give to someone or what they ought to receive. So for one, just a word of clarity on fairness there. Now, our focus for this unit is on these kinds of issues. Specifically, how should we react as people, as moral agents, as citizens of the world to extreme economic inequality? Because just for one, overall, the world is not a place that has a fair or equal distribution of goods by either use of the term. It's certainly not equal. Some of the readings that you'll have for the initial part of the unit, if you've not taken a look at those yet, help explain and lay out precisely how bad global inequality is and how much it can affect people, leading to massive deaths and poverty and lack of basic necessities. These are all things that I think it's very good to be aware of, because these describe some of the most pressing moral issues of the day, especially on a global scale, which is the sort of thing that we focus on in this class, or at least we try to. But given that things are that unequal, we have the question of how we should react as moral agents to this kind of inequality, this extreme inequality. What sort of systems should we put in place to try and fix this? What are the right solutions to this? What should we as an individual do? Do we have obligations to give and help, or is this not really our problem? Is this something that should be handled at the level of governments and societies and so on? And so, to help answer those questions, we're going to approach our topic through a couple of different lenses, and we're going to focus on a couple of different sets of concepts. Not because these are the only ways to talk about it, but because if you remember when we talked about how we do this class, we highlight different aspects of an issue and use those to have a better understanding of what the problem is and to better inform our moral thinking about that problem. And one important aspect of figuring out what people are owed, what is fair to give to people, what's a just distribution of the limited resources on our planet, is the concept of a right. And in particular, figuring out economic justice, figuring out distributive justice, demands that we balance two different kinds of rights. Now, some of you are probably familiar of the concept of a right, bit from history and political discussions, but I think it's worth being clear precisely what we mean by a right, because when in doubt, be more clear in philosophy. It's like our first commandment, if there were such a thing. Now, a right is someone's ability to justifiably make a claim to something, a claim that we morally ought to recognize and fulfill. If you have a right to something, then you can make a claim justifiably to having that thing. And you can say that you're entitled to have that or to be free from a certain kind of restriction. So, for example, a person who has a right to free speech is somebody who can rationally say with justification, you can't restrict my speech. In other words, a right to free speech means that you're entitled to not be limited in the ways that you speak or the ways that you communicate with other people, the ways that you share your ideas. A right to clean water, similarly, means that you're entitled to clean water. That is, you can morally make a claim saying, I ought to have clean water, if you do have a right for that. And this is the case both for a moral discussion of rights, which is our focus, of course, because ethics, but this is also largely the case for legal definitions of rights. To have a right is to have the ability to make a claim in a court or in a political system or in a society. Now, rights come in two different varieties, and these are two different concepts that are not necessarily opposed to each other, but they do require some balancing, because respecting one may at some times involve violating another. And these two varieties are what we call negative rights and positive rights. Now, a negative right is not a bad thing. We're not using positive and negative in this sense. We're using it in something closer to like a scientific sense, where we're talking about a negative right has to do with a lack of something. Namely, a negative right is a right that obligates other people to not interfere with your obtaining or having something. So a negative right is your right to not have other people interfere in your life in some way or to restrict you in some way. A positive right, by contrast, has to do with having something. It's a right that obligates others to help you obtain or have something. It's your ability to say, no, I ought to have clean water. And that seems to place some sort of a moral demand on others or on society or on somebody to try and help you achieve that and to obtain that. I think a couple of good illustrations of these kinds of things are freedom of speech and right to attorney. If you have a right to freedom of speech, this is a negative right. It's a right that says, no, you can't restrict me in the ways that I speak and communicate and whatever else. It's a right, it's a demand, it's the ability to make a claim against other people and say, no, you can't stop me. You shouldn't restrict me in certain ways. It's a right to not have restrictions placed on you. Whereas the right to an attorney is a positive right and a pretty clear one. In a court of law in the United States, you are entitled to legal representation. That is, you have the ability to say, no, I ought to have somebody who will represent me in a court of law. And others are obligated to help you achieve that. If you cannot afford an attorney on your own, the court has to provide you with one. This is a clear example of a positive right. It's being entitled to something in such a way that it obligates others to help you obtain it. And this is something that we have a lot of examples of. We might talk about people having rights to food or water or to safe housing or the right to decide what they do with their own bodies. We might also talk about people having in the negative sense, having a right to not have others interfere with what they do with their own bodies or what they do in the bedroom or how they act on their religious beliefs and so on. So generally, it's no issue to talk about having both negative and positive rights. At least in common discourse, we generally think that we do have both of these, both kinds of rights. But if we're going to figure out questions of what justice demands of us, we need to know how these different kinds of rights relate to each other, because there is a bit of a tension between the two. Because sometimes, as I said, respecting one kind of right involves violating or ignoring another one. Take something like I shouldn't say final, I should say initial illustration. Take something like the cookie distribution thing. Suppose that there are only a limited number of cookies in the world, because everything's finite. All our resources are limited and so on. Well, there is a finite number of resources, and there's also an unequal distribution of need. Some people need more than others. And so we might wonder about what does that mean for what people are entitled to? And because the cookies of the world, the resources of the world, aren't put in one nice, neat pile where one person gets to distribute them and decide where they go, we also have the question of redistribution. Because the cookies are basically scattered throughout the classroom, where some people have lots of cookies and some people have no cookies at all. And so if we were to try and achieve a fair or a just distribution, we would have to take them from some people and move them somewhere else. we would talk about those people being obligated to give some of their cookies to others. And this is where we start having the tension between different kinds of rights. We have to start deciding, how do negative rights to not be interfered with, where do those stop, and how do they balance against the right to have the things that we need to live? Because it seems as though in many cases we are obligated to help others. That seems to be a basic sort of claim of morality in many cases. So trying to balance those two concepts and figure out how they relate to each other is one of the things that we'll be doing in this unit, or at least one of the things that our readings will be doing, because we don't really have all that much discussion in here. It's mostly me talking to this computer and then indirectly your computer talking to you. But the different ways that we approach this and what sort of priorities we should give to the different kinds of rights, we can generally talk about with a couple of different categories of theories of justice. These aren't individual theories, these are umbrella terms, they are groups of theories, and they're not the only kinds of theories of justice there are. But they're two of the big ones, and they're ones that come up in our discussions quite a bit. And these are what we can call egalitarian theories of justice and libertarian theories of justice. Egalitarian theories argue that justice requires an equal distribution of goods and social benefits. And so egalitarian theories are usually going to stress some notion of positive rights. They're going to say something like, well, everyone's entitled to a certain share of the resources. They're entitled to a certain amount of benefit. And so it's going to talk about that positive sort of entitlement, that positive sort of right. And so egalitarian theories are going to say, yes, people can have positive rights to things, and we ought to respect those equally. And so we ought to distribute resources and benefits equally. Now, a classic opposition to this is what we can call a libertarian theory of justice. And this is not the libertarians in the sense of the American political party. That's vaguely related, but different context. We're focusing more on libertarian theories of justice, on moral libertarian theories. This sort of theory of justice emphasizes negative rights. And essentially, many libertarian theories reject the concept of positive rights altogether as being either incoherent or being violations of the more important negative rights, the rights that are more fundamental to people. And so libertarian theories of justice will generally say that no, there aren't any positive rights. And because of that, there are limits on how we can distribute goods and services. The only just arrangement of goods is one that respects the right of various people to be not interfered with. And so these two end up being somewhat of opposed to each other. And we'll look at examples of each so that we can raise some questions and look at how the theories work and so on. Now, a similar question that is another aspect to this sort of problem that we need to know as moral citizens of the world is, what should we do as individuals about these rights and how they obligate us? If there are positive rights, then do they obligate us to act? Are they things that we as individuals should respect and act on, and so on? In other words, we might talk about whether or not we have what's called a duty of beneficence. This is literally a duty to do good, a duty to benefit others, or to do as much good as we can given the circumstances and given the context. So a duty of beneficence is going to be something like an obligation to help others in need. And while in general, we generally think that we do have duties of beneficence, we have obligations to help other people. That generally seems to be an obvious sort of thing we can all agree on. But how strong that duty is, what precisely we're obligated to do, this is far more controversial. If we're obligated to help out people in need no matter what, wherever they are in the world, then that radically changes how we ought to approach finances and resources and how we spend our time. Whereas by contrast, if benefiting others, at least in certain circumstances, is what we call supererogatory, that is, it's good but not required of us, then that's something that changes the moral landscape entirely. A supererogatory action is one that goes above and beyond the call of duty. It's something that's good to do, but you're not obligated to do so. You don't have a duty or an obligation to do that kind of action. One of the classic examples of this sort of thing is like diving into a burning building if you're not a firefighter. Yes, it was a wonderful thing if you jump into a burning building and manage to save someone and pull them out of the fire. However, most of us would agree that you're not obligated to do so because it's probably going to end badly. If you don't have the training and the resources to do that sort of thing well or safely, there's no way that we can rationally expect or obligate you to do that sort of action. So, supererogatory actions, ones that go above and beyond the call of duty, ones that are good but not required of us, these are actions that are nice to do, but we're not really obligated to. And so, if helping people in desperate situations on the far side of the planet is a good thing to do, that seems obvious. The question is whether or not we have to do it, whether or not we're obligated to do it, whether we have a duty to do it. And these are questions that inequality and distributive justice raise for us. We'll take a look at a couple of theories that do discuss this sort of duty. Peter Singer, the same guy we looked at with the animal rights discussion, argues that we do have a very strong obligation to help other people. In fact, he's going to say that there's no such thing as charity in the normal sense of the word. Most of us treat charity as a thing that you don't have to do. It's nice, but you're not a terrible person if you don't give to charity. You're just maybe a little bit of a jerk. Singer is going to argue that you're actually doing something morally wrong if you don't give to try and relieve the suffering of the neediest people on Earth. Other views argue that given our limited resources, it's better overall to not do this sort of thing. And so we're not required. And these are also things that we'll look at. So, looking ahead with the unit, we've got a couple of other lectures lined out where we'll approach each of these main topics and sort of look at the different sides at the same time. For each of these, putting two readings in opposition. So, next time we'll start focusing on what constitutes fair and the different theories of justice and what they mean for distributive justice and how we should balance these different kinds of rights. And then for the second half of the unit, we'll look at duties of beneficence and how we should, as individuals, react to inequality and an unequal distribution of resources. In the meantime, take a look at the next couple of readings and then head on to the next lecture. Until then, good luck and happy thinking, guys.